It is my pleasure to introduce our next presenters. So first up, we have Miss Maureen Matthews, who is coming from the Manitoba Museum, and Miss Carol Beaulieu, and I will let them introduce themselves, and then after they're finished presenting, we're going to turn it over to some folks on Zoom. We'll hear from Julio, Cesar, Hoil, Gutiérrez, and I will introduce him after these two are finished. So I'm going to pass it off, and we're going to hear from them.
So, hello, everybody. I'm absolutely thrilled to be back here. I am a retired curator from the Manitoba Museum, and but I have been involved with the APS since long before I was involved with the museum. And I think what we in Canada would say, I'm a settler ally. I'm as Irish as you can get. My mother was born on St. Patrick's Day, so I have no claim, but I have since the age of 21 been working on projects that had to do with the preservation and support of Indigenous languages, and it has just been a lifelong enthusiasm, and I have, in that process, worked with wonderful people, and including Roger Roulette, who you were introduced to earlier, who came here with me, and now Carol Beaulieu. And it has been just the most marvelous place to do this work. The APS has been incredibly supportive. So the project I want to talk to you about has some of that really long-term relationship with the APS in it, and some more immediate things. When we were talking about what to say, because there's lots of things I could have talked about, Brad and I talked about how the APS doesn't really blow its horn sufficiently about the importance of the work you do here for other people and for even international institutions. So this presentation is about how the collection at the APS helped to create the only cultural landscape UNESCO World Heritage Site in Canada, and the first UNESCO World Heritage Site that combined culture and nature in an Indigenous way, in a way that's been used since by many Indigenous groups across the world. So this title of this presentation is Nametwaawin, and Nametwaawin has to do with the way that one claims land, and it's not a claim on the land, it is a claim that the land makes on the people. So just make sure I can make all this work. So the World Heritage Site I'm talking about is on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, middle of Canada, 2.9 million hectares. It is the traditional territories of 4 Indigenous communities, all Anishinaabe. This is the map that shows you where it is. It's a beautiful, huge piece of boreal forest, and it counts as the people who advocated on its behalf about a quarter of the really fluent Anishinaabe speakers left in the world. And so Nametwaawin, as I was saying, it has to do with this way of being on the land. And I've asked Carol to please do the honors here because I don't want to say some rude thing by accident.
Yes, and you will. Sorry. Okay, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Carol Beaulieu, and I was raised off reserve, as we call it, up in Canada. My father, he lost his, well, didn't lose it. He intentionally gave up his treaty rights so that we wouldn't have to live on a reserve, and also we kept our language, all of us. I'm very thankful for that. And actually, Roger Roulette, with the picture you saw earlier, he's technically my brother-in-law. So, and I'm sad that he's gone, but I'm married into the family. So, and I'm a mom and a grandma. I'm a great-grandma, actually. I have a 2-year-old great-grandchild. And anyway, I'll talk about this. Never mind me. Okay. Nametu is to make one's present known. So make yourself known, that you're not hiding or you're anything. It's nametu, that's how you say that. Nametwaawin is the act of making a claim by one's actions, and it's not owning something. It's just saying that I'm here, I'm relevant, and I want to be a part of whatever it is. Nametwaawin is to make broader use rights claim for any area such as a family hunting ground. So there was always this respect that, okay, the Beaulieus would hunt over there, and the Roulettes, which is my husband's last name, would hunt over there. And we don't really cross. And if we do cross, it would be with permission. So there's a form of respect with that. And the understanding, everyone else would understand that too. So, miigwech.
So these ideas are behind the claims that were made by those four First Nations, that's Pungassi First Nation, Little Grand, Bloodvein, and Poplar River. But in going forward to make a UNESCO World Heritage Site bid, what you are called upon to do, and this was an Indigenous group, it was their idea, was to create a bucket load of academic papers that supported the cultural integrity and the authenticity and the sort of outstandingness of their culture and also of their nature. So I was asked to do the cultural technical papers for them. And I came first to the APS because Irving Hallowell, an American anthropologist whose pictures we used, his archive is here. And his pictures turned out to be invaluable in creating a sense of the history and the continuity and also the integrity of the culture up there. So this is the APS. And I worked on these papers with Roger Roulette, he came here several times to work on the collections that are here. He did transcripts of so many of the conversations we had up north. And the first time we came here was this time that Brian was mentioning where Tom Belt and TJ were here. And Roger had never been to Philadelphia before. We were walking around the park. He was kind of nervous. We were walking around. And TJ and Tom passed on the other side of the street. And Roger leaned over to me. He said, "Those are Indians." And it was because really you don't see too many here. Anyway, it turned out that they were very friendly Indians. They got along famously, but Roger loved coming here. And he saw the point of the APS as a repository for Hallowell's photographs. But the conversations that we had had up north about those photographs with the people in the community, and he transcribed and translated hours and hours of those tapes that are incredibly important now. And thank you, Roger, your brother-in-law, my friend. So this is the group that put together the bid for Pamatuanaki, and Sophia Rabliaskas is the main push. And these people from these four communities were thinking really long-term. It was because they could have had a protest. There was some possibility of a power line coming across, and they were, getting revved up to lie down in front of the bulldozers and so on. And then, but Sophia was thinking, how do you get the province, the country, to accept your claim for this area, the kind of claim you thought you had with treaty, but was somewhat transparent. And the UNESCO World Heritage Site process involves getting the province to accept the characteristics of the site that you believe are really important, including language, culture, and control of hunting. And then that province puts it forward to Canada. And in the long run, Canada actually makes the case on behalf of this group of four First Nations to the world. So Sophia had this idea that would be a good way to do it, because in the process of doing it, you're getting every level of government to accept your right to say these things. So at a certain point, when Sophia was campaigning for the Pamatuanaki, long before the bid had gone forward, she came here to the APS. This was the conference in 2010. And so this picture shows Sophia beside Tim, and then me and Roger. We were all here speaking on this stage years ago. And this is what the planning meetings for the Pamatuanaki look like. The board members are all Indigenous. The advisors, the few advisors that there are might be non-Indigenous, but all of the active board members are Indigenous. And this is the group that finally went to submit the bid. Again, you can see they're almost all Indigenous from the communities. They had an amazing time in Abu Dhabi. And this is what the evidence that was put forward looked like. The three of those books are books that I wrote, basically, about the culture. And they were the evidence. But once the whole process was over, the next thing that had to happen was the people came to the community. So this is the community of Pangashi. And this is one of the most interesting features of it. The old medicine man in the community was said to have kept a dragon in a box at the end of this sand point. And when I worked with the community, I worked with Omishush Owen and Margaret Simmons. And you've seen pictures of them several times already. I was so incredibly fortunate because they were my link to the APS. This is a picture of Margaret's grandpa and Hallowell on that same hill where I took that picture of them before. And this is what Hallowell first saw when he went to Pangasi. And worked with Margaret and Omishush to go through Hallowell's photographs. That is how I came to know what they were about. And it turned out that the community of Pangasi has amazing cultural history, and that Omishush, as a descendant of one of the most famous medicine men, remembered the stories. And so over the years, I recorded 16 hours of conversation with him, which Roger translated and transcribed. He was talking about the elders in the community, and at the same time, as the Hallowell was photographing them, they were still practicing ceremonies. In Canada, there was a law against ceremonies that was started in the 1870s and was still in force when these pictures were taken. These people were just at a very hard place to get to, and they actually never even knew it was against the law. And they spoke to Hallowell in a way that probably people did who were not, affected by these government bans, and they were still practicing. So in this picture, you can see that they're holding implements. It happened that there was the ceremonial objects were collected by an anthropologist in the 1970s. So the bandolier, which Omishush is wearing, which makes him an honorary Bear Clan member, is in the museum collection. And Omishush was able to visit the collection and talk about it. So the integrity of the cultural picture was so fantastic, but it was all based on these amazing photographs that Hallowell had taken in the 1930s. And these objects have become really famous since, and but it was all essential to the building of the case for the people in the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this is an example of what Roger's transcripts and translations look like, word for word, but a translation for not kind of like syllable by syllable the way a linguist would do it, but for the meaning, and then an English version. But the exact Ojibwe words, and then then in English, just this is what he's talking about. And this is the grandfather of Namawan, the fellow who would have spoken to Hallowell at the time. And this is the elders in the community, the Yogichta, who are a very powerful group. And the stories of them and their healing and so on is the substance of most of Charlie George's stories. So I just wanted you to hear what it sounds like when Omishush is talking about his grandparents. So I'm going to try this. This is him talking about it. And so what he's talking about is the relationship between those objects in the collection, the objects in the collection and the medicine men, those people you saw in the previous photograph. And so the Ojibwe language allows for certain things which are apparently objects to be referred to as a kind of other than human person. And these objects are like that. And when they are like that, it's because they're in relation to somebody who's involved in ceremony. It's called wikanak. And so this is him talking about that idea. Just want you to hear him.
Kagi kakuetuit. Mega se anukse uihkan istigeuniwa. Mega sen skatamuat. Diihkan nanu kiitanawa. Otistigeuniwa. Mega man tohkeuniwa kagi tamuat.
So that's the voice of a person who is very confident in his culture and how these things work. And it's one more thing here. This is about his own personal experience, how he was in the Nametwaawin, and what it meant to him, what they were trying to do. He says, at the very end in Ojibwe, he says, it's how they acquired life, you see. So here it is.
Ingi mi teo mi oma. Ingi ni umine ki akusikiang. Mika ki mi teo at ki mi teo. Ka kong somsia. Ki sistika ewa oma wakano ikamik. Ki patakinat mistiko asini. Kinamia ono. Ka ki owiskani wat. Uiskan yok mionuno. Peeni kassin kiipi koaja sinoinke. Me olemskinak. Me maga kon se kaskes toar matisiwinna.
Sorry, they got running at the same time for some reason. Pardon me. But again, the second part of it, that is just an astonishing idea. And when we were developing the argument for the World Heritage Site, we were able to talk about the extent to which the language frames how people think about things. And he's talking about how a medicine man, in the course of a ceremony, spoke to their stones. They spoke to the ritual objects, and it was a communication, and that understanding the power of those objects to make things happen created the environment in which they thought about the world. And, I think probably enough of you know about Worf to know that the idea of language framing reality is a very powerful one. Hallowell certainly followed that idea too. He was very interested in the language. But he took in a remarkable picture. This is a picture of those poles that they're talking about. When it says they talk to their sticks, these are painted poles from the forest that had amazing powers. What I asked Omashush, what kind of powers? And he said, well, don't hit anybody with one of them. They'll die. So I thought, okay, that's very, But it was without the Hallowell background and without being able to talk to Omashush around those ideas, we could never have made the case that we successfully made in the end. So this is the drum that was in that collection that belonged to Old Nametwaawin, which became very famous. And this is one of the occasions when the collection actually was used with Hallowell's pictures. The audience for that day was two scientists from Europe who were deciding whether or not the World Heritage Site bid was a valid one. And it was incredibly important, the day. Tim was there, actually. He came all the way to Winnipeg to help argue for this. So there's also a beautiful dream drum that Hallowell photographed that was my intro to the whole world of Fairwind. And this is another Charlie George quote. And it was this Wiccan relationship, in this case, with spirit entities. And he's talking about why they had a drum.
Kakonsultteja kanivat. Bienestar nanis kakonsultteja kanivat. Anishinaabe istike uniue. Kaakispakitin kaate Anishinaabe istike. Nii oikeassa kaansit tuota muoti.
So I'd like to stop there and invite Carol to come and talk about this. I think one of the speakers earlier was talking about finding people to talk about who are engaged in culture at the level that you're at, and who are willing to talk across boundaries and to explain things. And Charlie George was doing that. He was talking in his own way about what he calls the Anishinaabe cultural way of thinking about things. So, do you want to? Yeah.
Can I sit down, please? No. Yes, and going through these transcripts, actually, and listening to them now, I didn't really do this kind of work. I was involved in it, but more in a administrative kind of way. But once Roger passed away, we decided as friends and colleagues to keep on his work because he did like 30 years of translation and things like that. So the goal is to make a dictionary at some point, and it's very hard to put all this kind of stuff on paper, so you do have to know the background and the nuance of each word, or like for the Thunderbirds and what they mean to people and what they mean to Anishinaabe people. So those are the kinds of things. And unfortunately, although we have a lot of speakers, we have about 30,000 speakers of Anishinaabe over from Alberta, Saskatchewan, all the way down to here, Wisconsin, Minnesota. There's a lot of them that are second language learners. So they don't have the cultural background per se. You know what I mean? They speak the language, but they don't have the nuance that goes with the cultural pieces. And that's the unfortunate part. That's why for example, if you go to Minnesota, most of the Anishinaabe people that are learning there are second speakers, but they all sound the same. And in Canada, when you go to, you know who comes from Saskatchewan, you know who comes from Manitoba, you know who comes from Ontario. So just by the way they talk. So they still have that cultural information background. But unfortunately in Minnesota, because no fault of their own, they don't have as many speakers. My understanding, there's only like 50 speakers, first language speakers of Anishinaabe in Minnesota. So they are eventually going to sound the same. And that's what's happening with Anishinaabe. And for example, I do some teaching, and I have a great friend that helps me. Her name is Kate McDonald. She's listening over there. And I told her, I think I told her I was going to mention her name at least. But we're working towards trying to change that, because that's how we met. Her and I met because she said she was in my class, and then I'd say a word, and then if it needed explaining in a cultural way, then I would be able to explain that. And that's where I thank my parents. That's how they raised us. We weren't allowed to speak English at home. As soon as you got off that school bus, that's it. No more Shaganashimuin. You don't speak. But I lost my parents when I was young, so I'm reclaiming my language as I go. So, and all these things come into play when you're hearing the language, and then when we're working on the transcripts, it's like, yeah, that's what it just really refreshes your memory and makes you really think about things. So, miigwech.
Let's give them a quick round of applause. Yeah, go ahead and say one more
I'm going
thing.
to say one more thing. We have the books from the communities, for the communities here. If anybody wants to see them, hopefully we can put them up somewhere. And also, Maureen is very modest, but she has a book. She has several books, but one book is about Nametwaawin, that older gentleman that you see in the front there. I don't know which, and
If anybody's looking
yeah.
at a pamphlet about the APS, you might recognize.
Thank you.
All right, next up we're going to hear on Zoom from Dr. Julio Cesar Hoil Gutiérrez. Originally from the community of Xcalacop in the Yucatán Peninsula in Mexico, he is a native speaker of Yucatec Mayan. He has a doctorate in history from the Center for Research and Higher Education in Social Anthropology. He is a professor and researcher with the Benito Juárez Universities at the Peace Day campus in the Yucatán. He has participated in domestic and international conferences, and he has published articles in journals and anthologies published in Mexico and the United States. He is a co-editor, along with Dr. Fernando Armstrong, of the book titled Legacies of Space and Intangible Heritage, Archaeology, Ethnohistory, and the Politics of Cultural Continuity in the Americas. His field of research is focused on the documentary heritage of the Mayas of the Yucatán, agrarian processes in the Yucatán between the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, and local ethnohistory. Another recent area of his research has focused on the social study and cultural relations between Mexico and the U.S. during the second half of the 19th century, supported by archival sources from the United States. He is also a collaborator in the area of history for the project Tangible and Intangible Heritage, Archaeology and History in Tehosuco, directed by Dr. Richard Leventhal of the University of Pennsylvania. So we'll turn it over to Zoom.
Kima Kinwol, Intak Pahalte Much Tambala, Tialingwesi Kimeya Yosal, Uyuch Bencajo Le Mayaka, Yan Yucatano. Ahora en español. Estoy muy contento, mi alma, mi espíritu se encuentra muy contento en participar en esta reunión para presentar mi trabajo, mi investigación sobre las tierras ancestrales de los pueblos mayas de Yucatán. También quiero agradecer a los organizadores de la conferencia del aniversario número 10 del Centro de Investigación de Estudios de Nativoamericanos y Indígenas. Y en especial quiero agradecer a Ruth Ruiber por apoyarme en la comunicación con la APS. Y también pues un saludo para los moderadores o la moderadora y a los presentes, al público presente. Me hubiera gustado estar presencialmente, pero por razones personales y de salud no pude viajar. Mi presentación, el título es Las tierras ancestrales de los pueblos mayas del oriente de Yucatán y su relación con los documentos agrarios de la reforma agraria mexicana, desde 1915 hasta 1940. Bueno, la imagen que ustedes ven es un grabado que muestra a un campesino mexicano que tiene dos artículos muy importantes de la Constitución mexicana de 1917, que es el artículo 27 y el 123. El artículo 27 se refiere a la distribución o reparto de tierras a los campesinos y el artículo 123 a los derechos laborales. Y va a ser muy importante este artículo 27 en esta presentación. ¿Podrían pasar a la siguiente, por favor? Gracias. El objetivo de esta investigación es...
The objective of this research project and this presentation is to analyze how the ancestral lands of a group of Mayan peoples in the Yucatán in Mexico were transformed into a social collective farm known as ejido in Spanish, social property, through Mexico's agrarian reform, which was begun in 1915, beginning in 1915, as one of the most important achievements of the Mexican Revolution of 1910. In this process of transformation of ancestral lands into a collective farm, various documents, agrarian documents, were issued by the government, which contain information regarding the ancestral lands of the Mayan peoples of the Yucatán. We propose that the transformation of our ancestral lands of the Mayan peoples of the Yucatán into a collective farm has a dual effect. Firstly, it served to produce agrarian documents during the agrarian reform. Secondly, the Mayan peoples still maintain connections and links legally and historically with these documents, which are only held in certain communities, and in practically all cases, they are in the National Agrarian Registry in Mérida and in Mexico City. The information contained in these documents, these government documents on the agrarian reform, is activated when the same Mayan peoples and researchers consult them to resolve agrarian problems and to become aware of the basis for these peoples.
La reforma agraria mexicana.
Mexico's agrarian reform began in 1915 during the government of Venustiano Carranza. Agrarian reform was one of the significant achievements of the Revolution of 1910. It signifies an act of social justice for millions of smallholder farmers, and it became one of the constitutional mandates ordered by the 1917 Constitution. And this mandate specifically was established via Article 27 of the Constitution, which ordered the restitution and distribution of lands and water sources to millions of smallholder farmers for their agricultural activities. It radically transformed the holding of the land and of Mexico's countryside. The agrarian reform was a communitary reform, which means that a collective group of people, generally a community or a rural community, was subject to the agrarian action or was the party receiving the lands being delivered by the Mexican state. The distribution of the lands was the primary channel via which the agrarian reform was implemented to fulfill its mission of social justice. The agrarian reform in Mexico was executed with greater strength, beginning with the administration of the President Lázaro Cárdenas in 1934, and continued until 1992, the year in which it was finalized via neoliberal reforms in Mexico.
Esta palabra va a ser muy importante.
The word ejido is going to be very important. Ejido, which can be translated as collective farms,
concretó parte de los objetivos
made concrete part of the objectives of Article 27.
y se convirtió en la principal figura
And these
agraria
collective farms became the primary agrarian figure used by agrarian reform in order to redistribute lands to the communities and peoples. The image you can see, that's a painting that's in the Museum of Art in Philadelphia. It's by Diego Rivera regarding the revolution, liberating the serfs who worked on the farms. The next image.
Es muy importante para nosotros.
This is very important for us, the concept of the ejido, the collective farm, as part of the analysis of our research. Currently, there are 30,000 ejidos or agrarian nuclei in all of Mexico, occupying 50.8% of our national territory. To give you an idea of the significance of these collective farms and the amount of lands that these ejidos contain in Mexico and the magnitude of agrarian reform. Ejido has two meanings. The first one can be understood as an agrarian nucleus, a population nucleus which contains legal status and is recognized by Mexico's constitution. The collective farm, the ejido, has its own patrimony and is the ejido is the owner of the land which has been redistributed. The second meaning refers to lands which are subjected to a special regimen of collectively owned property and generally are collectively used. We are interested in emphasizing this last meaning of ejido, as these are the type of property into which our ancestral lands were transformed, the ancestral lands of our Mayan peoples in the east of the Yucatán through the agrarian reform. In this sense, we will be using this second meaning of ejido in referring to this second meaning of ejido in referring to this agrarian legal concept in the following pages. So this image that you see on the screen, these are smallholder farmers meeting with government officials. And that blue document, if you can see that, that's a blueprint outlining the lands of the ejido being given to the smallholder farmers. The farmers are receiving the title to these lands as part of this agrarian reform. This is a mural by Diego Rivera, the great Mexican muralist who did many murals about the Mexican Revolution. This one is from 1924. Next slide, please. The central argument of our research project is that Mexico's agrarian reform transformed into ejidos these ancestral lands of numerous Mayan peoples of the Yucatán, which brought about the creation of government documents which were
para el Estado
useful
mexicano
not only for the Mexican state, but also for the
yucatecos.
Mayan indigenous peoples of the Yucatan in the
De manera
present
particular,
day.
nuestra
In
investigación
particular, our
se
research is
enfoca en los
focused
pueblos mayas
on the
del
Mayan
este de
peoples
Yucatán,
of the east of the Yucatan
periodo
and covers the period of 1915
a
through 1940.
Exponemos de manera
We
particular
present, in
los
particular,
casos
the specific
de los
cases
pueblos de
of
Tixcacalcupul,
the communities of
Temozón,
Tixcacalcupul, Temozon, and Guayma.
Bueno, ahí pueden observar ustedes
And
Yucatán,
you can see here this map of the Yucatan
México, Yucatán.
on this map of
La siguiente,
Mexico.
por favor.
And next slide, please.
Y bueno, y aquí pueden ver en la
And here
parte
you can
está
see
Valladolid. Bueno,
Valladolid.
Chichén supongo que es muy conocido, es famoso.
I assume many of you know Chichen.
Y pues si pueden ver Valladolid,
And if you
en su
can
lado
see
derecho,
Valladolid on
en
the
la
right
parte
side,
norte,
to
hacia
the
arriba,
north,
pueden ver
up
Temozón,
above that you will see
dice
Temozon, where it says
En la parte
Temozon.
sur, abajo,
On to the south, you
está
will see
Tixcacalcupul,
Tixcacalcupul,
y hacia su lado izquierdo
and to the left,
está el pueblo de Guayma.
you will see
Bien,
the town of
esos son los
Guayma.
tres pueblos que yo
These are the three
analizo.
towns
Hay más
that
pueblos, por
there,
supuesto,
of course, there
pero
are many more
solo voy a
towns
analizar estos
and
tres
communities,
casos.
but I will only be analyzing these three
Siguiente
cases
punto.
due to limitations of time.
Consultamos principalmente los
We
expedientes
primarily
agrarios
consulted
del
the agrarian
del
files of the
Registro Agrario Nacional.
archive of the National Agrarian Registry in
Entre los
Mérida.
expedientes más importantes
Among the most
podemos
important
mencionar la
files, we can
resolución
mention the
presidencial.
presidential
Este
resolution,
documento contiene
a document that contains
toda la información
all of the
relativa a las
information
tierras,
related to these
fueron
lands,
entregadas a los pueblos,
which
y
were
esas tierras
delivered
contienen
to
información de las
the
tierras
native
ancestrales.
peoples, and
También
this
tiene
document has information on the ancestral lands and contains a map as well.
Estas fuentes,
These
estos
sources,
expedientes,
these files,
describen la cantidad de
describe the
tierras
amount of
que
lands
poseía el pueblo antes
that the
de
people
recibir
possessed
los
before
tierras
receiving
o antes
the
de
ejido or
1915.
before
Es
1915.
decir,
That is to say,
indican la superficie
they
de los
indicate
terrenos
the surface
ancestrales
area of
de
the
los pueblos
ancestral
mayas.
lands of the Mayan peoples of the Yucatan.
También fueron de utilidad
They
algunas
were
fuentes que encontramos
Other
en
sources
el
were
archivo
useful as
general
well, sources we
del
found in the general
Yucatán.
archive of the state of the
Gracias a
Yucatan.
estos documentos,
Thanks to these
hemos
documents,
podido seguir
we have been
el
able
proceso
to
de
follow
transformación
the
de los
process of
pueblos agrarios de los
transformation
pueblos mayas
of the ancestral lands
de
of the Mayan
Yucatán,
peoples of the
reconocidos
eastern
durante la
Yucatan
reforma
into
agraria en
ejidos during the agrarian
1915
reform from
1940.
1915 through 1940.
La siguiente, por favor.
Next, please.
Bueno, ustedes pueden
And you can
observar,
see
este es uno de los expedientes
this is one of the files.
donde, se llama, es el expediente
It's called
dotación
the
ejidal
file
de la
of distribution,
tierra.
delivery of
Y
ejido
estos
lands.
expedientes tienen números
These files have
registrados,
numbers on their documents,
y también la resolución presidencial.
as
La
well as the
resolución
presidential
presidencial
resolution. The presidential resolution is the legal document
que avala
that
la entrega de tierras de ejido a
certifies
los
the
pueblos
delivery of the
agrarios.
ejido lands to the communities.
Es uno de los ejemplos que
This
de
is
los
one of the examples of the
que
files
consultamos.
that we consulted.
Por el tiempo del que dispongo, presentaré solo
Due to
esos
limitations
tres
of time,
casos.
I will only present these
Repito,
three
el pueblo de
cases. I
Tixcacalcupul,
repeat the
Temozón.
towns of Tixcacalcupul,
El primer caso
Mazón, and Guayma. The first
corresponde al pueblo
case
de Tixcacalcupul,
corresponds to the town
una
of
localidad ubicada
Tixcacalcupul,
a 20
a
kilómetros al sur de
town
Valladolid,
located 20 kilometers to the
que
south of
durante la
Valladolid,
guerra de castas
which during the
era
caste war
frontera con el
was
territorio controlado por
a
los
border
hermanos
town with the
encarcelados.
territory controlled by
Hago un breve
the Mayans
paréntesis
who
para
were in
señalar que esta
uprising.
guerra se
I will
inició
make a
en
brief parenthesis to point out that
1847
this war began in
y concluyó
1847 and
en
concluded in
1900.
1900,
Tuvo como principales
and the
causas
main causes of this war
injusticias
were
agrarias
the agrarian
del gobierno
injustices and fiscal
yucateco
injustices
contra los
committed by the
mayas.
government of the Yucatan against the
Se
Mayan people of the
considera
Yucatan.
la guerra
It
de
is
castas
believed
uno de los
that the War of
levantamientos
Castes is
armados
one of the
indígenas más
indigenous armed
importantes en la
uprisings which were the most
en
significant
la
in the
Segunda Guerra
Americas
Civil
during the
Española.
second half of the 19th
Tuvo
century.
significadas
It had
repercusiones
significant
sociales,
social,
económicas
economic,
y
and
políticas
political
en local,
repercussions at a local,
nacional
national, and
e
international
internacional.
level.
La posición geográfica de
The
Tixcacalcupul
geographical
durante la
position
guerra
of
de castas
Tixcacalcupul during the War of
permitió
Castes
conservar sus tierras
made it possible
ancestrales
for them to
bajo su control
preserve their ancestral lands and
e
keep them under their control,
impidió
and impeded the snatching of these lands by the hacienda farms, although they were devastated during the war. The file of the presidential resolution of Tixcacalcupul, which you see here, that's a file which among its documents contained therein indicates that this community of Tixcacalcupul has had possession of, since time immemorial, of 12,000 hectares, equivalent to 29,000 acres more or less of land. In other words, Tixcacalcupul has possessed this land surface area before the agrarian reform and without knowledge of how long that they have had held those lands. This is what is referred to by the term time immemorial. These lands were of common shared use, as indicated by many colonial sources, indicating that the exact date is unknown when this began. The second case is related to the community of Temozón.
Temozón se encuentra situado a 5 kilómetros al norte de Valladolid.
Temozón is located
tenía la categoría de pueblo y contaba con
to the north of Valladolid. It has, in 1927, it had 200 men as heads of family and single young men older than 18 years old with the right to receive the ejidos. It's important to remember that the subject of the agrarian action was a collective body of people. That is to say, the people receiving the lands, it always had to be a collective group of people, as indicated by Article 27, the Constitution. The file of the presidential resolution, which is this here, of this community, registered and recorded that Temozón has had possession peacefully and quietly for more than 10 years of an approximate territorial area of over 6,000 hectares of land. From other sources, we could observe that Temozón already had their lands since the first half of the 19th century, if not since the colonial period. Our last example, next slide, please. This is the file for Guayma. All of them look similar because the process was a uniform process for the distribution of the lands to communities. So the covers of the files always have this same look to them. They look uniform. All that changes is the file number and the name of the community. And of course, the details are different for each file. The second case is the case of the community of Temozón. I'm sorry, our last example, rather, is the community of Guayma, which is 10 kilometers to the west of Valladolid. In addition to the documents produced by the agrarian reform, we have another type of sources which reveal the antiquity of the lands of Guayma, which subsequently became an ejido in the file for the presidential resolution of Guayma in 1927, which is this file. It was recorded that before 1915, they had in their possession land located to the south of the town with an extension of 3,000 hectares. As in the previous cases, they do not mention on the document that how long they have had in their possession these lands. However, thanks to other sources dated for the second half of the 18th century, we discovered that in the lands of Guayma go back to the colonial period. In fact, on the next slide, please. In fact, in 1844, they paid a surveyor to draw up the blueprint indicating the map of these lands. And you can see here on this image, this blueprint, this map. This is the map for the lands of Guayma from 1925, the map of the ejido. And if we go to the next one, please.
De las mismas tierras, pero que fueron realizadas antes de la reforma agraria en
the
1844.
same land, but it was done in 1844. And you can see it looks very similar to the previous plan because it's dealing with the same land. And the ancestral lands of Guayma date back to the colonial area, as I mentioned before. So we can also see that the Guayma lands, they possessed their lands since colonial times. These ancestral lands of the Mayan people in Yucatán did not consist of just mere natural resources that they used for subsistence. They were spaces that additionally
eran espacios que tenían un carácter histórico.
They had a historic character and a symbolic and identity charge as well. So we define these as ethno-territories. An ethno-territory is a historical, cultural, and identitary territory where an indigenous people recognizes them as their own, and they find the appropriate conditions to reproduce themselves biologically and culturally. These are identity symbols because it is this very specific geographic space with boundaries leading up to other communities or locations. And they allow us to understand the valuable indigenous knowledge and learnings about the environment and as traditional and sacred use, and also so we're getting close to the end here. How did these ancestral lands of the Maya people in the east of Yucatán become ejidos? It was through Article 27 of the 1917 Constitution that we've referred to before. So this article converted lands. So our Article 27 converted in ancestral indigenous lands of Mexico into property of the nation. And so that also included the Mayan peoples of Yucatán. So once they had been converted into national lands, the Mexican state followed a very long bureaucratic and legal process to endow or distribute ejidos to indigenous people with national lands. So during this process, numerous files were produced, and they were made up of governmental documents as well as those that were written by the peasants or farm workers. This process of endowment or distribution concluded with the resolution of the president, which is the file that contains all of the information that is related to the endowed ejido and to its plan. So ancestral lands of Tixcacalcapul, Temozón, and Guayma underwent a metamorphosis due to the mandate of Article 27 when they were converted into national lands. And once they were converted into national property, the Mexican state used those very same lands to then convert them into ejidos for each one of those peoples in between 1920 and 1940. And so here we see their supposed social justice. So the 12,000 hectares that Tixcacalcapul possessed or owned before 1915 were converted into a ejido with the agrarian reform. And the same thing happened with the ancestral lands for Temozón and Guayma people and many other peoples as well. So the presidential resolution, together with other files that were produced during this whole process for endowment or distribution of lands, are what constitute the legal documents that constitute the endorsement or the proof of these ejido status. So thanks to those sources, we've been able to understand better that conversion of ancestral lands from the Eastern Mayan people into ejidos during that Mexican agrarian reform. And so my final comments,
Bueno, aquí solo les quiero
So
mostrar.
here I just wanted to
Este es
show
un
you,
plano que
this is another plan
pero se realizó durante
that was
la
also
reforma agraria del pueblo de Temozón.
undertaken when the Temozon
Abajo se ve el pueblo de
ejidos were,
Temozón.
and you can see underneath it towards the bottom, there's the actual town of Temozon, and we can see that land, which is about 9 kilometers
Este de Temozón.
east of Temozon.
Esas tierras
And this land are the ones that were converted into national lands. And then those lands were possessed by Temozon much before that, even before the colonial, but at the very latest, they date back to the colonial era. And they've continually possessed them, and they had them in their possession during all of the 19th century. So once we have the agrarian reform with Article 27, they convert those lands into national property, property of the state. And then the only thing that the Mexican state did was then produce legal documents to then convert them into ejidos, calling it the town of Temozon. That's all they did. So final comments here. The ancestral, sorry, I'll go to the next one.
Las tierras ancestrales.
The ancestral lands possessed by the Mayan peoples in the eastern area of Yucatan since colonial times, which we also have defined as ethno-territories, were converted into state property by the Mexican government with Article 27 of the 1917 Mexican Constitution for the purposes of agrarian reform. So with ancestral lands, they created ejidos into towns like we had already showed you in the cases of Tizcacalcapul, Temozon, and Guayma. During this process of creating ejidos, numerous documents were produced dating from 1915 to 1940 and a little longer that contained records of the ancestral lands of the Mayan peoples of the Yucatan. So the files for each ejido are the documentary patrimony and the sorts of consultation for Mayan peasants and farm workers to resolve any sort of issues they have in their ejidos, and we can find those within those different files. They are also very useful documents as well to understand part of the founding history of these towns, and especially for Mayan researchers who are interested in their local history, such as in my case. So in this sense, this documentation is maintained active and dynamic, not only by the Mexican state itself, but also by people, because they are consulted, and it's very good as far as, resolving agrarian disputes, and to also understand the history of their towns and their people. So whether we call them ancestral lands, ethno-territories, or ejidos, these lands are still the same spaces where the Mayas of the Yucatan are able to find part of the meaning of their existence up until today. Thank you so much.
Gracias.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions, so I want to check to see if anybody in the audience has a question that they'd like to ask either Maureen and Carol or Julio on Zoom. And if nobody in the audience has any questions, we'll check on Zoom as well.
Hi, voy a hablar en español. Julio, gracias por tu presentación. Bueno, yo estudio lingüística, entonces me cuesta mucho entender como la parte histórica de los ejidos y tierras comunales y tierras ancestrales. Quería preguntar entonces si en México lo que conocemos como tierras comunales son los ejidos o más bien esa es otra cosa. Perdón si es muy básica la pregunta.
Sí, los ejidos se distribuyen. Yes, ejidos are distributed in 3 different areas. There was one specific space, and they would have, it was subdivided in 3 sections. In parcels, common use lands, and then urbanized spaces. So that would be there were 3 different subdivisions, subdivisions within an ejido.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room?
Yeah, this is for Julio. Can you hear me? Okay. Sí, señor, si usted puede ayudarlos a entender mejor, ¿cómo fue el impacto de eso, lo que se llama la guerra de castas en la garantización de esos derechos, de esos ejidos? ¿Cómo fue el impacto de esa guerra de casas en esa garantización de derechos?
Muy buena pregunta.
It's a very good question. That's a very good question. And I had to write my doctoral thesis to be able to answer that question, which is what I'm sharing. But the war, what I'm proposing here is a cultural, the caste war conditioned indirectly
la reforma agraria,
the agrarian reform in the area where that war occurred, because it was thanks to that war that many of those people and all of the people that I presented and the lands that I presented and showed you on the map, among those, the ones I shared, many of those peoples, they were able to take lands that were theirs before the war. And because there were haciendas, and so they conserved those lands, they expropriated them, and they didn't have a lot of issues as far as losing them because of the haciendas, because those hacienda holders were really afraid of being able to once again establish haciendas, because then they would be destroyed by the Mayas who had their uprising. So the caste war contributed so that the Mayas were able to conserve their lands and keep their lands, a lot of land. And then once we have the agrarian reform, the only thing that was really achieved by that was to legitimate the fact that they already possessed those lands even before the reform.
A question right here in the middle.
Oh, I have a question for Maureen and for Carol. So I appreciated your presentation very much, and I especially appreciated the ways that you used some of the quotations to demonstrate the I'm not coming up with the right word, the living nature of objects. But it also seemed to me that there was an organic or a living element to the language that also moved or animated through speech. And I'm wondering if that's part of what you fear can get lost when you're moving to secondary language speakers as opposed to primary language speakers.
Yes. Yes, that's an excellent observation, because our structure is based on animate and inanimate. So you could have a rock, for example. It's technically inanimate, but if you use it in a ceremony, it becomes animate because you're associating yourself with it. And we also have no gender in our language. You're just, he or she. Every time we write stuff, it has to be he/she. But you don't need the gender. So, and yes, that's a good question. It's great. Thank you.
And these projects that we've done with the APS have helped us make that case. You would think that having lots and lots of speakers is kind of like your bulwark against the loss of cultural concepts, but it isn't enough. You really need the old language, and you need the kind of real depth of those old conversations to bring back some of the really important cultural ideas. And it's partly, that because the language is still spoken, it's being used innovatively and in modern ways. But it is really important to have this old language to go back to. So when I talk to that old man, Omashush, and recorded the interviews with him in the 1990s, he already sounded like a person who lived 150 years before. He never did learn any English, and he was in the hospital for about 6 months at a certain point. He never even learned the word for toilet. He just absolutely didn't pick up on that. So when he spoke Ojibwe, it has this incredibly beautiful flow. If there are 5 words for something, he will use them all. And I was very interested, in the idea of animacy in objects. For the most part, you refer to a drum as an animate entity. But Omishush, who knew drums upside down and sideways, he would talk about them and use a really sophisticated Ojibwe way of kind of using the language to point at something that's really important and then deflecting away, like, oh, we don't care about that. So 1 minute the drum would be a water drum belonging to my grandmother, my grandfather, the next minute it would be the old man's pail. And then it would be actually a grammatically inanimate term he would use, just something to beat on. And it was that fluidity of concepts and that capacity to use the language to kind of show importance and then deflect from importance that's just so beautiful. And that's the kind of thing that these recordings have in them that are very hard to find elsewhere. And that's to me why it's so important. And I think Carol's had a revelation starting to listen to all these things.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, I only had the language up to the age of 14, so I guess I technically got most of it. So, you can learn right from a little baby to 14 years old and still be able to understand. I'm very thankful that I can do that, to understand what this older man is saying. So, yeah.
The other thing is that Roger, who worked with him initially, it has to be a relationship. And so the relationship was established when Roger observed that Omishush was wearing a bandolier. He said, oh, you must have been an honorary Bear Clan member to wear that bandolier. And Omishush said, yes. Roger said, I'm a Bear Clan too. And it was like that. After that, they were buddies. And there are little things like that when you see them in the transcript. You see how the relationship that creates these very deep conversations comes about. And I think there's a lot to be learned from just that part of it. And so the other thing I didn't mention is that I recorded 16 hours of Omishush and many, many hours of Ojibwe speakers. Brian was talking about that project they did on digitization, and they did 3,000 hours of digital recordings, and 500 of them were mine. And I am incredibly grateful to the APS, because I would have spent the rest of my life running that stuff off. But what it means is there's real depth there in that collection. And then Roger worked on Omishush, 16 hours of Omishush. And we have 1,200 pages of word-for-word transcript and side-by-side translation. And so Carol and I are here for another week after this to work with Paul and the other geniuses here to figure out how to link the transcript and the audio so that instead of somebody saying, oh, I want to hear Charlie George say something about this, I have to go to 1 hour, 37 minutes and 12 seconds to find it, that you can highlight the transcript and the computer will jump to that audio and play it for you, because this is so important, the words he uses and so on, that for learners and speakers to be able to discover vocabulary that way, to really find what they want quickly, is going to make all the difference to whether Charlie George changes the world or not. I think he will.
All right, thank you. And I think we have a question from our Zoom audience.
Are we ready? Okay. This is a question from Anha Toucher. She's asking, does the Mexican federal government recognize the sovereignty of the Mayans or of individual Mayan communities? For example, does the central government retain the right to appropriate land for a purpose such as a road or an oil pipeline?
First of all, there is no acknowledgement. There's a big debate right now And it's been a debate ever since the Zapata movement. So that's one. So there is no acknowledgement. And number two, in 1992, with the neoliberal reforms in Mexico during that government, Article 27 was modified, and it did not allow the expropriation of land by the government. However, it was modified so that way the government, the Mexican government, the Mexican state, and individuals can expropriate land. And we're seeing that now with several different projects ever since 1992 up until the current time. And so there's also, we're seeing hydroelectrics and dams and so like gas lines as well. They did it for that purpose. And so now they are able to say for public purposes, they're able to expropriate land.
These guys, our presenters, another round of applause. Thank you for sharing.